right, I think we'll begin now. This webinar is originating from the city of Vancouver, which is founded on the traditional and unceded territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh. Some speakers will be presenting from other locations, and we respectfully acknowledge those traditional territories. Hi there, my name is Sophie King. I'm the Manager of Professional Learning at PIBC, and I'm very happy to welcome you. One moment. And I'm very happy to welcome you to PLN webinar number 6, Proactive Planning for Big Needs in Small and Mid-Sized Communities. Our program speakers today are Emily Gray from the city of Delta, Hasib Nadvi from the city of Maple Ridge, Chris Osborne from the Municipality of North Cowichan, Deanna Wasnik from the city of Prince George, and I would also like to welcome Guy Patterson with Young Anderson, who has participated in several PLN and regular PIBC webinars, who will be answering the legal questions. So welcome everybody. Thank you for joining us. The webinar is being recorded, and we will be sending you a link to both the recording and the slide presentation shortly after the webinar. After all the speakers are done presenting, we will move on to the Q&A portion of our program, answering as many of the pre-submitted questions that you sent us at the time of registration. So now, before we begin, a quick note about the PLN. Through the PLN, or Peer Learning Network, PIBC continues to engage regularly with Ministry of Housing and Municipal Affairs staff. The ministry is currently working on new comprehensive guideline documents about proactive planning. PIBC will share more information about the release schedule as soon as we learn more from the ministry, so stay tuned for that. As well, through the Peer Learning Network, PIBC is undertaking case study research to provide peer-to-peer information about the implementation of the provincial housing legislation. For more information, you can contribute and how you can contribute your experience and expertise, please see the PLN webpage on PIBC's website. And finally, PIBC has scheduled the next PLN webinar for April the 30th, and it is about the development economics of housing. So that should be a very interesting one as well. And now we will begin with our first speaker, Emily Gray, the city of Delta. Welcome, Emily.
Hi, everybody. Thank you, Sophie.
Hello.
Great. Okay. So as Sophie said, my name is Emily Gray. I am the manager of community planning at the city of Delta. And I was asked to kind of focus on how we are doing proactive planning, how we're working to meet the provincial requirements, and also how we're making sure that we're servicing that with infrastructure, or how we're planning to service that with infrastructure. So today, there we go. I'm going to focus primarily on our OCP update. So we completed, as many of you know, an OCP update is due kind of at the end of 2025. We actually did ours early. We did it last year over a 5-month period. Sorry, my Teams is going nuts. I hope you can't hear that. And yeah, so I'm going to explain that and how infrastructure really fed into that update. And I'm also going to talk about how we're meeting some of the other requirements. So just a bit of context, we do have a council right now with a strong priority to build housing and grow sustainably. So we were issued a 2023 housing target order. So we were one of the first 10 municipalities, and the focus on housing did align with what our current council has as a priority. So we've done some work on small scale multi-unit housing, obviously, as we all have. and I'll get into that a bit later. And on the proactive planning approach, I mentioned we did things a little bit backwards. We did an OCP update. We have also done our housing needs assessment update. We do have one transit-oriented area, but it's got very limited impact, and I'll touch on that a bit later in the presentation. So I'm going to start with the housing need because this is really what drove our approach to doing the OCP first. And so we were issued a housing target order of 3,607 net new completed homes between 2023 and 2028. And as many of us know, that reflects just 75% of the estimated housing need using the housing target order methodology. And again, as we've touched on, like the provincial legislation obviously requires official community plan, OCP, zoning bylaw updates to address the SMU, the small scale residential housing, transit-oriented development, and also to accommodate housing capacity anticipated over the next 20 years, not from the housing target order, but from the housing needs assessment. But the reason we took on the OCP so quickly is because our existing OCP, when we received the housing target order, was originally developed in 1985. It was one of the oldest ones I had seen. It obviously could not keep up with current housing situation, the pressures, the housing target order, and it really impeded the uptake of small-scale multi-unit housing and missing middle housing opportunities. We had something like 30 plus OCP amendments in the pipeline for things as small as 2-lot splits. And so we recognized right away this was an impediment to being able to work towards our housing target order. And so how we presented this to the community is we showed that with projected growth, we had custom projections prepared that took into account the housing target order. We anticipated that the population could increase by 31,000 people over the next 20 years, or about 14,000 households. And you'll see in this graphic, this was really helpful for a lot of our public materials because it illustrates kind of where we were at and the housing needed versus if we were to continue business as usual without updating the OCP and without allowing more housing, where we would be. And so we kind of distilled our focus into 3 big changes for the OCP update. Those were increasing opportunities for townhouses and apartments in key locations because we knew that was a good opportunity to get more homes in the ground. And simplifying land use designations, we really are focused on streamlining the development process, and there were more than 75 land use designations in the old OCP. And then also enabling small-scale multi-unit housing, knowing that that was coming down the pipeline. And so we looked at infrastructure and servicing as kind of a key input into where we identified areas for townhouses and apartments. So this map was done through Complete Communities work, and it shows areas which are close to transit and daily needs, shop services, that kind of thing. And we actually overlaid this with areas with existing or planned capacity in the utility system. And so that gave us a really clear picture of where it made sense to allow for higher densities than were previously allowed. So these areas are highlighted in orange here, and they kind of focus around key corridors and in urban centers in each of our 3 distinct communities. So if you don't know Delta, I'll just pause here a little bit. We have up in the top right corner, that's called North Delta. It's a bit urban. That long stretch of orange is the Scott Road corridor. It's got a rapid bus. It's a very trafficked corridor. We have Ladner and we have Tawasin, and those are both comprise South Delta. Surrounding that, we have mostly agricultural, conservation, and some industrial land. So we really do have a pattern of 3 kind of core community areas, and we were able to identify key corridors and centers within those communities where it made sense to focus density. And I mentioned simplifying land use designations. One of the things that I think we're most proud of is we simplified from more than 75 to just 10 land use designations. And of course, can't do an OCP without doing engagement, and this was a challenge in a 5-month period. But we were very fortunate to have a wonderful manager of engagement in our communications team who really helped us she spearheaded this. We were able to do 3 citywide mailouts. We engaged, so 3 times 44,000 households, so 3 of those. We engaged more than 1,200 residents over 6 open houses. We received more than 1,000 feedback forms. And we kind of did this all over about a 1 month to 6-week period. We recognized that our hands were tied a little bit with, we needed to create more housing capacity because of provincial requirements. We knew we needed to do that. So it wasn't so much about, how do you feel about us doing growth? It was, how do you feel about where we've put the growth and how it affects your community? So we really focused on maximizing awareness of the provincial requirements and the need to do this and opportunities to participate. So we had open houses, we had a website, we had feedback forms, we had an email address, phone calls, in-person visits, everything. And we found that generally participants in the engagement program understood there was a need for growth. Um, with areas of Delta kind of varying on whether they agreed with the approach to managing growth, but overall generally supportive of and recognizing the need for additional growth. There were some really clear key concerns raised through the engagement process. Infrastructure being one of them. So how are we going to service this growth? What's the traffic going to look like? Are there public services and amenities still going to provide the level of service that they did under the old OCP if we are enabling all this new growth? And participants really just wanted to understand how those would keep pace. So of course, through the OCP process, we worked closely with our other city departments, engineering, parks, recreation, and culture. We worked closely with Delta Fire and Delta Police. And we did, as I've mentioned, really focus on growth in areas where the infrastructure supported it. And we also spoke to the sub-departments about kind of the importance of sub-plans. So engineering actually has some neighborhood servicing work underway now. Parks and Recreation has a master plan underway because the OCP can't do everything. It can't lay out how the servicing is going to be, specifically provided for each community. But it can set the framework that is informed by what the departments and what is possible. Of course, hospitals and schools are a bit beyond our jurisdiction, but if we engaged Delta School District and Fraser Health with our growth projections. We do this on an ongoing basis for all major projects, of course, to make sure that they're aware of where we're thinking of growing and how many residents we're expecting. So the OCP, of course, is a living document. We are required to update it every 5 years now. And we are committed to working towards the housing target order. We were one of the first, we believe, to complete the OCP update in response. Future work we need to do on it is to make some updates to the development permit areas. And we also need to complete our review to ensure that we've really created the capacity we need to meet the needs identified in our housing needs assessment. So I mentioned I'd touch on the other legislative requirements. The housing target order, we address this by incorporating it into the projections that underlie the OCP. So we feel like we've created the capacity to be able to meet that. It's just a case of hoping we can meet that within the time frame. Transit-oriented area, I mentioned this has a limited impact. It actually falls within our Scott Road corridor designation, which has a much higher designation than 12 stories anyways. And small-scale multi-unit housing, I do have a couple slides on this because we did our first phase of zoning bylaw amendments in June 2024. But we recognized in that first phase that we have more work to be done. And we committed to doing kind of 6 months of reviews and coming back to figure out what would be phase 2. So when we implemented them in June 2024, we didn't make changes to site impermeability, site coverage, setbacks. We focused on the general regulations and opening opportunities for doing 4 units on one lot. So what that looks like right now is you can do obviously single detached, you can do duplex, do single detached with a suite and a garden or garden suite. You could do a duplex with 2 secondary suites, duplex with 1 suite and a coach house. Many combinations that are possible to achieve that 4 units. And we did review over the first 6 months. We went back to council, I believe it was at the beginning of this month, with a report indicating kind of level of interest, concerns, and also reporting on our planathon event. So we hosted a planathon event in late fall last year to kind of promote small-scale multi-unit housing in Delta, and it was wildly successful. We had, I think, close to 400 participants. And we got a lot of feedback there about what we could change in the zoning bylaw to make small-scale multi-unit housing more viable in Delta in different forms. So we are now considering the following zoning amendments. There's a list here: houseplexes, height and density and related parameters. We're looking at consolidating and simplifying single detached and duplex zones. I mentioned we did this initially under our general regulations. We would obviously like to streamline our single detached and duplex zones to provide more simplicity. We'll also be looking at the minimum lot size for subdivision. We continue to work on infrastructure planning. I think Delta, as many of you guys probably feel the same, it's really challenging to plan for the infrastructure needs for small-scale multi-unit housing because it's just so uncertain how many units will come on and when and where. So we continue to work on that. We also continue to advocate to the province for infrastructure upgrade supports to support it, and changes to the BC Building Code to allow 2 secondary suites in 1 home. And we were one of the lucky recipients of a letter from the province. We got ours in January, saying basically they wanted us to reconsider kind of the site standards manual, what we were doing for SMU. And, we did make a commitment already in June to, reconsidering what we were doing for SMU. At this time of the year, we are doing it. So I don't anticipate any further, I'm hoping no further letters. And I do hear that a lot of colleagues on the call have also received a similar letter in their community. So I think we'd be curious to know if any communities have not received a letter asking to do more on small-scale multi-unit housing, because I'd like to see what you're doing. Great. And that was everything. I think we're holding questions till the end. But yeah, thank you for your time.
Great. Thank you so much, Emily. And now we'll move on to Hasib Nadvi of the City of Maple Ridge. Hi, Hasib.
Sophie, hello everyone.
Welcome.
Oh. Sorry, I'm recovering from a cough, so if I hack up a lung, please excuse me. So I'm Hasib Nadvi. I'm the Associate Director of Planning and Building with the City of Maple Ridge. This is really some really incredible work done by my colleagues, so it's a privilege to present on their body of work. So like everyone else, I'll touch a little bit on the housing needs assessment, and we're in the second quarter of the housing target order. We'll discuss, we did some infrastructure assessments, so we'll discuss SMU and our infrastructure assessments and quickly touch on the transit-oriented areas. We have 3 stations, and finish with the new provincial announcement for bus rapid transit connecting Maple Ridge to Langley, and Langley through a SkyTrain to the rest of the Lower Mainland. Right, so we finished our housing needs in September, presented that in front of council. So currently the city's at 106,000 people, and the projection for 2041 is over 130,000 residents. We followed, based on the housing needs methodologies, what would be the units required to combat housing crisis, which is around 28,000, and Out of those, the projected and latent demand based on community growth was around 18,000 units over the next 20 years, so which is 2/3 of that, what we would need to combat housing crisis. So, like I mentioned, we're in the second cohort of the housing target order. So the housing target orders roughly add up to roughly 4,000 units, a little less than 4,000 units, which is, like Emily mentioned, 75% of the housing needs. They kind of align with our housing needs assessment for the next 5 years. So our council adopted a second housing action plan. The first one was adopted in 2014, and we had some immediate short and long-term priorities. So I put the image for standardized housing designs from the province. We're going to take that over the next few months and come up with pre-approved building designs with references to the building code for easier building permit processing for residents to come up with pre-approved designs. Another priority is to have a unit mix policy, mostly for apartment buildings. We already do that. This is really to make sure that we don't end up with 80% one bedroom and studio units in an apartment building, rather to focus on some family-sized units. We do have a rental protection policy, which of course doesn't apply to pre-zoned properties. So having the new legislation allowing us to have a bylaw and a development permit for rental protection would really fill that gap. Some other short-term considerations would be when we update the OCP and the zoning bylaw, we would consider the rental tenure zones. We have CACs in place, so it's to come up with a framework for how to work with nonprofits and BC Housing to bring some non-market development into the city. In the long term, this is our council is looking to establish the feasibility of establishing a land reserve, which would really look into the lands that we own right now and the feasibility of developing in those lands, whether from a servicing and hazard and the location perspective, and also to see if we can buy strategic properties within the city to establish a land reserve. So coming to SMU, so we adopted within the provincial deadline, of course, but we had a public-facing web tool where you could put your address and you will know if you're within a prescribed bus stop, thereby giving you 6 units, or whether you're getting 4 units, or whether you're outside of the urban containment boundary, thereby you only are allowed for a coach house and a secondary suite. Ended up in us creating an urban residential zone, and which would replace our single detached zones, and the lot coverage and the permeability kind of goes hand in hand. So the 60% is for 6 units, 50% is for anything less than 6 units, and it's to really address the stormwater management and also urban forestry requirements was part of that consideration. Where you are within a 400-meter prescribed bus stop, we don't require any parking anymore. I have not seen a SMU application, so it would be really interesting to see what the market demand would be. This just went in front of our council in the last couple of months. It's a 900 square meter lot. It meets the setback. It's within the height, conforms to the neighborhood quite well, but because it's a 900 square meter lot, you can kind of see, it does a good job in doing some tree retention. But when you get to very smaller lot sizes, I just wanted to put that up on the slides, because this is one of the few subdivisions in Maple Ridge where the lot sizes are 300 square meters. And if you really look at the photo, it's pretty self-explanatory. There's really no room for urban forestry management, or if you're even to do a duplex and you had more than one parking space per required per unit. There's not a lot of room for you to have even parking, and all the stormwater would be really through a pipe system. We looked into our servicing needs for water, storm, and sewer, and water wasn't interesting. Anything that's colorful on the map, so the pinks and the shades of blues really have fire flow and water pressure issues. So that leads to two different considerations. So can we, within the NFPA and FUS standards, can we look into to see maybe increased fire separation and sprinkler systems would allow our fire flow requirements to decrease a little bit, but it really ends up with some reservoir improved upgrades that we would need. So that brings me to I call it the barter method. So we have area plans that, for example, let's say multifamily townhomes are allowed in this area. They're not pre-zoned, but SMUs are pre-zoned. So does SMU take away from some of our more multifamily developments? It could be a limiting factor. We'll see how these things develop in the future, but our next step is really to consider DCC bylaws and come up with cost estimates so we can put into those DCC bylaws. That's in the work plan for this year as well. Sewer, we got lucky. So all the bubbles and the sewer, it's really the same capacity constraints we had identified. It's just getting exacerbated through SMU, but with phasing and our capital projects, because they're already DCC eligible projects and we have been collecting funds and we'll continue to collect funds on this. We think with a good phasing and prioritization plan, we can upgrade in a manner that would address the capacity constraints we have. But it's a luck by chance scenario. The storm is quite an interesting one because we typically retain the 10 years on site and the 100 years kind of flow to the municipal system. But if we're to retain the 10 years on site, it'll be a 255 million price sticker shock. So what the recommendation was that we would retain 100 years, 100-year storm on site, and there's some design guidelines around it, which would limit that need for a lot of storm upgrades that the study identifies. I just wanted to touch on the servicing officer aspect. Of course, when the servicing officer piece came in around road dedication and everything, we thought it would be followed by the regulation that would allow you to appoint servicing officers pretty shortly or quickly, but that didn't happen. So we kind of ended up doing a bluff. I call it a bluff, but it's the developers or the builders we speak to, they would rather know what the road dedication requirements would be than come at a building permit stage and just be surprised with what the road dedication would be, and that would change their setbacks and everything. But now, as of within the last 3 weeks, we have the regulation, so we can appoint servicing officers. So that worked out well. So 2008, there was a Golder report that the city commissioned. It looks at the Fraser River escarpment area. It summarizes that anything within 100 meters of Fraser River shouldn't have, there's a lot of risk and shouldn't have higher density. And on your screen, that's the black hashed area. Those are major landslides, parts blocking Fraser and going to the other side of the river, causing fatalities. So combination of zoning and DPA, we will not allow SMU in those major landslide areas and within 100 meters of the escarpment, but it will have a hazard zonation approach that's based on that geotech report. We did a flood hazard study as well, and this is an interesting one because part of me cannot really, it's a misnomer because if you really look at to the left or to the west, the blue is really a floodplain. And if I was doing proactive planning, I wouldn't really put SMU in a floodplain. It's mitigable. You can mitigate this by being a moat. But if I was doing proactive planning, I don't think I would put SMU in a floodplain. But I think we'll be reacting to these in the coming years. Quickly touching on transit-oriented areas. We got 3 transit-oriented areas related to West Coast Express. Really, it's within 200 and 400 meters. So 400 meters is where you get the 8 stories. 200 is where you get the 12. Sorry, my Teams just went off. So what we're really seeing with the 8 stories that's from developers, and this case study is one that's going in front of council. It's gone through ADP. 8 stories is not really, the return on their investment doesn't add up, especially with the parkade cost and the high water table that we have in Maple Ridge. So this development, for example, they stayed at 6 stories, and the market for their parking requirements were really over a unit, which is kind of what or consistent with our draft parking bylaw that's coming in front of council. Bus rapid transit, it's a new provincial announcement that we had earlier in 2024, and that connects Willowbrook to Maple Ridge. We get 4 stations. The smooth guide actually, not the smooth guide, the TOA manual actually speaks to perhaps making these TOAs in the future, but these are not transit-oriented areas right now. So that means we'd have to, we're still going through a low-hit transit corridor area plan to understand how the BRT stations and the density and the land use designations around it, just so that we're consistent when the day comes. This is quite the thing with the developers, because whenever there is a BRT or bus rapid transit, that means you need additional road dedications. As we work with TransLink and the Minister of Transportation, which is still underway, it's very early stages. We had to pause the applications, and if you can imagine the BRT, the picture on the screen that's to my right, if you can imagine low heat and a BRT station we're trying to fit in, will require additional road takes, and that is anywhere from 4 meters to 8 or 9 meters on a property, and then that becomes your new property line, and on top of that there's Minister of Transportation setbacks for your park gates. So you end up losing a lot, and it sends you back to the drawing board to see how you can manage your park gate designs and building face setbacks and all of that. So it's a lot of unknowns, and BRT planning, it's kind of new to the province and to the city. So we're really working with the provincial agencies to try and figure out how to move some of these projects forward, because they're in stream and they have holding costs from the developers. I'll just leave this one on the screen because I think I saw a question about what are all the different initiatives that the city is taking. The point of this slide is really there's a whole lot and there's not enough staff. Let's leave it at that. Thanks.
Great. Thank you so much, Hasib. Much appreciated. If you've been following the chat, we did ask everyone who works for local government to let us know if they received the letter from the province. They could just type it in the chat window, and I will send this chat to everybody after the webinar, so we'll all kind of know which municipalities received the letter. On to our next speaker now. We have Chris Osborne. Welcome, Chris.
Thank you, Sophie. Can you see and hear me?
Yes, I can. And Chris is representing the Municipality of North Cowichan. And I will get your presentation up and running. And there you go.
Yeah, thank you. Okay, so my presentation will have a laser-like focus on infrastructure, and of that specifically water and sewer, although the principles are generalizable to other infrastructure systems. And really in the last 6 months, I think I've spent more time with our Director of Engineering than anyone else in my life. So what I want to do in this presentation is, through some hokey PowerPoint animations, visualize the impact of Bill 44 on our development trajectory and on the infrastructure that surrounds it. Show you our commitment mapping exercise, which really formed the foundation of developing a list of actions that we feel are necessary to manage this growth more proactively in this brave new world. And then finally, we'll try and visualize exactly how those actions help us. A bit of context for North Cowichan. So we're located on Vancouver Island, halfway between Victoria and Nanaimo, located on Cowichan territory, which covers a large part of southern Vancouver Island, the Gulf Islands, and even stretches across to Sea Island, where YVR is located. That was a traditional summer camp of the Hulkaminam people. The modern day Municipality of North Cowichan is a small triangular portion of that territory located just north of the city of Duncan. And we are a district municipality. So we have 32,000 head of population distributed between 3 very distinct and separate urban centres, which have the fragmentary infrastructure nature of a regional district, but we have truly urban levels of growth within these urban centres. And just to complicate matters further, the largest of those systems, the southernmost one, is shared jurisdiction between us, the city of Duncan, Cowichan tribes, and the regional district. So infrastructure management and planning is by no means trivial in our area. So I want to model in a simplified way what that looks like with Bill 44. So prior to Bill 44, we had fairly stable levels of growth, about 1% year-on-year growth trajectory over time, a steady increase in the amount of units that we have. And at any given point in our jurisdiction, there is a maximum amount of infrastructure available, whether that's water or sewer as the limiting factor, doesn't really matter, but there is a limit. And then the DCC bylaw identifies upgrades that are necessary at some future time to buy us that additional capacity to continue on growing. And the space that you have between the development that exists and the commitments in the pipeline and your maximum capacity is what I like to call your pre-zoning headroom. So that's the extent to which you can give away development rights through zoning, confident in the knowledge that you have the infrastructure capacity to service it. So what happens when a Bill 44 drops in your midst is that overnight, it immediately does a huge amount of pre-zoning, and it does it in 2 ways. It does it through the 4 units as of right zoning amendments that we were all required to do in urban areas. And it also does it through the requirement to pre-zone for the 20-year housing target identified in your interim housing needs report. If you're lucky, the 4 units as of right may mop up your 20-year requirement, but if it doesn't, then you'll have to do additional pre-zoning, probably for higher density stuff in addition to that. Either way, the effect of it is that now the amount of pre-zoning that's gone on, possibly or perhaps even probably, exceeds the available capacity you have to service it. Because of course the infrastructure systems were designed based on that historical development pattern of 1% per year, largely single family. And the DCC bylaw is reflective of that as well. But of course, the whole purpose of Bill 44 is to stimulate additional growth. It is to bring online additional housing units that would not have existed if it were not for that legislation. So it is to bend that curve upwards and to do so quite significantly. And it's easy to see what the problem is. You enter these danger areas where now you are entering essentially negative capacity. And the deeper you get into that, the more profound the risk and the more serious the consequences. You can't really allow the sewage to be running down the streets or not to have sufficient water pressure for firefighting purposes, particularly with 6-story wood frame buildings. So in reality, you can't really go into that capacity and you might end up coming up against that ceiling sooner rather than later. And then you're in this unhappy position of having to deny basically everything in sight. So you're going to have unhappy developers, a stressed out administration, and an embarrassed council for quite a period of time until that infrastructure upgrade finally comes along, and then a whole load of pent-up demand can be released, which itself can create problems. And you've got this unstable boom and bust kind of trajectory, whereas previously you had a trajectory that was under your control. And that matters because our ability to control that trajectory and put a ceiling on it through the judicious use of zoning powers is now greatly diminished. And we're far more now a victim of circumstances, or having to respond to what might come. So a lot of people here will have done modeling based on the legislation, and the smooth entities were no different. There's in light blue our historic trajectory, and even without Bill 44, that's no longer considered a reliable indicator of what might happen in the future. The housing crisis post-COVID, we're in a completely different realm now. So that serves perhaps as a useful baseline, but certainly nobody expects that we will continue with such a low growth rate. Next is we're also one of the lucky ones that received a housing target order. That adds a fairly minor increase on the baseline trajectory, certainly nothing to lose sleep over. The next one mapping onto this is more significantly the 20-year pre-zoning required by Bill 44. If all of that is realized, then it results in definitely a more significant increase in population. Finally, these two blue curves represent the complex build-out modeling that's mentioned in the SMU handbook. We did it business as usual and with the impact of Bill 44. So you can see from those curves, even without Bill 44, we're experiencing significant near and midterm development pressures. And that is evidenced by the final curves here, the two green ones, which is looking at all of the development applications that we have in the hopper, and what they imply in terms of units and how quickly they're expected to build out. So if everything we have got approved and was seen through to completion in a realistic time frame, we'd be looking at that top curve there. Of course, that's not realistic. They're not all going to get approved, and of those that do, not all of them will arrive at a stage of completion. So through a whole variety of assumptions and adjustments, we've come up with a more realistic curve, which comes out at around about 50% of those. So again, looking at everything we have in the hopper, we can expect about 50% of that ultimately to materialize as new units. So you need to pick a trajectory on which you're going to model your and plan your infrastructure needs. So it really does matter, that growth trajectory, because the implications are the ultimate amount of servicing capacity that we have. Certainly in a place like North Cowichan, it's highly location sensitive. So although district-wide we have quite a large amount of capacity to service growth, we have certain areas where the capacity is currently zero. And that doesn't necessarily align with where the development pressure is or is not. Also, new upgrades that were not foreseen by the old DCC bylaw are identified as being necessary. And then where capacity is limited, who gets access to that? So then that brings forward questions of timing and priority for upgrades. How do we reprioritize our capital works program? And how does it get paid for, which is the multi-million-dollar question? Is it through DCCs? Is it through debt financing and front-ending by the municipality? Or are there deep-pocketed developers who can build the infrastructure and late cover it? So what we did is we took all of those applications that we have and categorized them according to what commitment to servicing is implied. So certainly if you take everything that has a building permit, there is a very, very high expectation that there will be servicing available for it. And if you're refusing occupancy on a building permit because you don't have infrastructure capacity, that's a very difficult, risky legal situation to be in. So certainly all of those applications go to the front of the queue in terms of encumbering the infrastructure systems and allocating the residual capacity that we have. The next three are where the zoning rights are already in place, and there's a high degree of intent by the site owner that someone wants to go ahead with development, and an expectation that with the zoning being in place, that it can probably be serviced. Bill 44, the SMU one, slightly below that, medium. At a site-by-site level, it's no less of a commitment than the ones above because it is pre-zoned. But the nature of the SMU densities are that it's very diffuse, and we certainly won't see anything close to 100% realized in any meaningful time frame. So collectively, it feels like a bit less of a risk. And then finally, at the bottom, you have the applications that are far more discretionary, the applications that create the capacity demands in the first place, where you have considerable discretion not to approve them if you don't have capacity to service. So that was a GIS exercise to then map all of those applications out spatially and tag them with the attributes of how many units they contain, what types of units, and even the timescale and phasing in which we might expect to see those come online. And that then brings us to all of the various actions that we think are necessary in order to manage the infrastructure systems going forward. And I've listed them here in approximately the order that we've started them. It is only approximate. Apologies for the wall of text, but I've tried to break it up with color coding, and the significance of that will be clear on the last slide. So the first two I've just shown you, that's the commitment mapping and servicing capacity, modeling the growth trajectory, including site-by-site modeling for new development applications as they come in. The next is, with that trajectory now having been determined, looking at the capital works program and making sure that those new upgrades are now identified in an updated DCC bylaw. Of course, there's long lead-in times to do that, and you've got a year's grace period. So what we're looking at is adopting a CAC policy that will, for anything that does need a rezoning, and we do have some capacity for it, that they will agree to an infrastructure contribution that would be approximately equivalent to what we expect the new DCC rate to be. So effectively waiving that 1-year grace period that would apply. And then once the new DCC bylaw is adopted and has been in effect, that policy can then be rescinded. It's having served its purpose. But it makes sure that today's developers are not being subsidized by tomorrow's, because ultimately that could create a future pinch point where development simply becomes financially unviable because you've backloaded so much of the infrastructure cost burden. Fourth one is your last line of defense. These are the bylaws that facilitate a physical connection to those infrastructure systems. And if you are at capacity, then you don't want to be making those connections. So you need to make sure that you are on a firm legal footing to deny that if you have to. And you do have to give yourself the right to do that. The next three in green are really about file management and triaging the flow, or regulating the flow of development approvals in the system. First is a fit for scheme for access to that residual capacity. So as our lawyer likes to say, the race is to the swift, but it is a bit more nuanced than that in how you determine who is first in the queue. There isn't necessarily a legally right or wrong way of doing it, but it does need to be consistent and transparent if it is to be defensible. Prioritizing DPs relative to rezoning, that seems fairly obvious that you want to manage the applications where the development rights already exist, rather than creating yet more development rights for which you may not have servicing capacity. And then where you do rezone, and there is capacity, or there will be expected capacity in the future, making sure that it's very clear that you don't get to build until that infrastructure is in place to service you. And then those last three actions, 8 to 10, refer to the capital works program and how you bring the infrastructure up to meet the demand. And in the final slide, we're going to map these actions onto those growth trajectories. So here's our situation. Here's our background growth. We've got our infrastructure capacity as it is today, as envisioned by the DCC bylaw, and we have some infrastructure upgrades planned in the future. Bill 44 has dropped, and now our pre-zoning is way in excess of our available capacity. So we've diligently done our modeling and mapping to figure out what the growth trajectory looks like and help us determine what capital upgrades, what new ones are needed, and in what order in time they need to be brought forward. So that reprioritization will effectively move those upgrades forward in time to meet the demand, the increased demand earlier than we were expecting. Not only that, we need to expand the scale of those upgrades and the financing thereof to buy ourselves additional capacity beyond what we originally thought would be the maximum necessary. In the medium to short term, you can probably wring a little bit more capacity out of your existing infrastructure systems through small, relatively inexpensive upgrades that buy you some dribs and jabs, and also through risk management, i.e. By trimming some of the conservatism in the engineering estimates, you're able to create on paper a little bit more capacity. Obviously, there's a hard limit to how much you can do that. And below that, a soft limit in terms of how much risk your engineering director is willing to shoulder. But there are things you can do to kind of just bend that ceiling upwards a little bit so that your growth trajectory now arising from Bill 44 hopefully stays within that pre-zoning headroom that you've got within the capacity you have to do it. And those file management actions will help you keep that curve regulated in the short term, so that not everything that has a development right gets approved tomorrow. It's really phased out over time. And then finally, in the event that you do bump up against that limit and you have to deny connections, it's for as short as period as possible, and you're on sound legal footing to do so. So all of those numbered actions there map to the actions on the previous slide, and you'll be able to look at those and compare them when the presentations are distributed after. And I think that's all I've got time for. So thank you very much.
Great. Thank you so much, Chris. We'll go on to our next and final speaker, Deanna Wasnik. Hi, Deanna.
Hi, Sophie. Thank you.
You're very welcome. And here's your presentation.
Good afternoon, everyone. Deanna Wasnik from the City of Prince George. I'm the Director of Planning and Development, and I'm joining you today from a partly sunny above zero day in Prince George. So very exciting. Happy to talk to you today about some of the proactive planning measures we've taken at the city in response to the latest provincial legislation. Today's presentation, I'm just going to go over a bit of the Prince George context and our response to the provincial legislation, our latest OCP project that we are in the midst of having reviewed and approved by our council, our responses to housing and infrastructure. So just a bit more about the context of Prince George. We are centrally located in the province. We are on the traditional unceded territory of the Lheidli Nation. We're a mid-sized city with about 85,000 people and approximately 800 kilometers north of Vancouver. We are also home of the champion of the 2024 Great Canadian Landmark Contest, Mr. PG. He's our iconic landmark and is situated at the Highway 97 and 16 intersection, which is our busiest intersection as it's the meeting of the two provincial highways. All right, so a bit more background about Prince George. This slide becomes important when we talk about our growth priority and infrastructure story. In 1915, you can see the boundary of the city was quite small, and through the years from 1953 to 1974 saw the greatest growth and expanded to 61 square kilometers. Through 1974 and 1975, within 1 year, the boundary grew roughly 5 times larger and is now, present day in the 2023 version there, we are at 329 square kilometers in terms of our area. Within our area, we can fit the area of Victoria, Nanaimo, and Saanich. And again, this is just an important, I think, just a visual to show our land mass, and tied to our population of only 85,000 people, this poses some challenges in terms of our planning for infrastructure and growth. So the City of Prince George, our responses to the provincial legislation, starting with Bill 44, we were able to make the amendments to the zoning bylaw completed by the required deadline of June 30th of last year. Our zoning bylaw wasn't too difficult to update because it already permitted secondary suites and single family dwellings, as well as secondary dwellings in the form of detached cottage or carriage house. So we had to just do it was more or less tweaking to our bylaw to accommodate the Bill 44 direction. Our council mostly supported it with their questions were mostly, or their concerns, I would say, were mainly around the impacts of perhaps on servicing, which has been noted by some other presenters today, as well as parking. Some of the outcomes, our uptake has been minimal within the City of Prince George in terms of creating the 4 units per site. However, through previous rezonings that predate Bill 44, covenants that were registered on title that prohibited or limited secondary suites or the creation of more units are the types of applications coming forward now that we are having to amend the covenants to remove that restriction to allow the Bill 44 regulation and our zoning bylaw to prevail. We've also, through just some of the applications that are more in line with the multi-units per site, have noticed that we now need to make some other updates to other internal bylaws or city bylaws with respect to service connections, notably. Duplexes right now since they're allowed to be permitted to have secondary suites, our servicing bylaw and the fees associated are not reflective of that type of housing or number of service connections being provided. With respect to Bill 47, the transit-oriented areas, in Prince George, we had only one legislated TOA, which was the UNBC bus exchange. We, again, met the deadline of last June 30th to adopt through bylaw the TOA designation. The outcomes through our council, again, just questions regarding the location. I have maps following to show you why the questions were being raised about the location of the TOA, and that the encouragement of development such as housing or other land use types around this TOA might be difficult. So this is a map of, just a zoomed in map of where our TOA has been designated. This is the University of Northern British Columbia. The green circle is the 200 meter catchment, and the pink circle is the 400 meter catchment. So the intent of the TOA was to locate high density mixed use development within walking distance from frequent transit services. And although frequent transit exists at UNBC Bus Exchange, there are limited to no daily needs amenities or services or entertainment available at this site. The UNBC Bus Exchange is approximately 2 kilometers from the nearest neighborhood center and residential neighborhood. Another challenge with the site is with respect to the land ownership. It's not only removed from where the core of our neighborhood amenities and residential spaces are, but also with the land ownership to facilitate or help encourage development is a challenge. The area shown in green on your screen is the area and lands owned by the university. The area in blue is owned by the city of Prince George, and the area in yellow are privately owned parcels. So you can see the UNBC Bus Exchange TOA reaches 4 properties. And aside from a large portion of it being owned by UNBC, the portions that are privately owned or owned by the city have geotechnical and topographical challenges in terms of development. So this is a bit of a head scratcher why this was selected as our TOA site. And just to give further context to those on the call, this map shows you more where the core and the bowl of the city is, where we have most of our commercial, residential, and light industrial uses occurring. The blue circle is our neighborhood centers, is where we would encourage like the multifamily and larger density developments. And you can see the little bus symbol, which shows you where our other transit exchange areas are. So yes, the city would have, I think it may have been more advantage to have one of the bus exchanges in the city or the bowl be selected as a TOA to help facilitate the density that the legislation is seeking. Our OCP. So we commenced a review project of the existing OCP, which was adopted in 2012, in January of 2023. So this legislation was timed kind of nicely for us because we could still, within the review of the OCP, incorporate the direction of the legislation the province directed us to do. So we've done that. And also in conjunction with the new OCP review project, we conducted through grant dollars a complete communities assessment, and that was received by council in December of 2024. Some of the outcomes with the official community plan As I've noted, it reflects the housing needs as informed by our housing needs report. It reflects bills 44 and 47, and it aligns the growth priority areas with our infrastructure systems. The intended outcomes of, we hope, fingers crossed with this OCP, is policies and vision that reflect the current trends in legislation, assists the City of Prince George with prioritizing our capital plan projects, that's mostly related to our water, sewer, storm systems, and provides the policy direction for infrastructure master plans and updates to bylaws associated with development. So the City of Prince George at this time hasn't taken up a lot more work on reviewing the legislation changes under Bill 46. We've noted them, but again, because we were right in the middle of our OCP review, the DCC bylaw is one of our top bylaws to review this year in consideration of Bill 46, as well as the amenity bylaws and such that may be other tools for us to consider to address our housing and or infrastructure needs. With more focus on housing, we were issued our housing target order on August 1st of last year, so we're brand new to the game of the order. Our order requires us to have 1,803 net new housing units between August 1st of 2024 and July 31st of 2029. We just took our 6-month report on Monday of this week to council, and we have achieved 77% of our year one targets, and we are on target to fully achieve the units necessary for the coming years, with a mix of a whole bunch of different housing types. Some of the actions we took in response to the legislation from the province coming down, it became obvious that housing was going to be king. And in terms of resources in-house at the City of Prince George, we don't have a dedicated division to housing. So we were able to obtain grant dollars to create a position called the Housing Development Liaison. This person is doing everything housing and is very much involved in the list that's on the screen before you. We also, so that position was created, and that they were also able to help us meet the interim housing needs assessment update that was required by the end of last year, or by January of this year, I'm sorry. And so that's been completed. And we've also taken on land use process improvements to help streamline rezonings and those types of applications to improve efficiency and reduce processing times. We are also in the midst of activating a permitting software upgrade, which will require and have our applications be submitted online more digitally versus in person, because we are still pretty reliant on paper. And we also have approval through our council to have minor variances approved by the Manager of Development Services. So there's a threshold to that, but that has also reduced the number of variances we've had to take to council for certain heights and parking restrictions and such. We've also created a professional reliance building permit policy to streamline mostly the Part 3 building types. And our housing development liaison role has also helped in applying for the half dollars in rounds 1 and 2. We were unsuccessful in round 1 and have heard nothing yet on round 2. And they've also helped us create a housing action strategy, which is intended to go to council this spring. It's recommending options for us to consider as a city and as a council to help encourage the growth and bring more units online for housing. I mentioned the Complete Communities assessment, and we've also, through different roles within the city, been able to partner with BC Housing and Northern Health Authority. I apologize for that typo. So BC Housing, we've entered into a partnership and have a transitional housing facility established on city-owned land. And through Northern Health Authority and the City of Prince George and BC Housing, more units are being constructed for supportive housing on a city-owned parcel. So just tying the presentation up with our infrastructure, I noted the slide of our boundary growth and why this is posing a bit of a challenge. The OCP in 1979 forecasted a population of 185,000 people in Prince George by the year 2012. That clearly did not happen, and growth slowed in the 1980s. So most of our infrastructure was built during that spike of the boom prior to the 1980s, and has resulted in now, this time, 2025, of most of our infrastructure aging out. We've also, through the amalgamation of the city boundaries, inherited infrastructure that was never installed or was to any standard the city of Prince George would have had back in the day. So we are trying to also adjust and react to the demands that might be in systems that are quite aged, and we have no record or understanding fully of perhaps what needs to be done. So further analysis. So what does large land base plus aging infrastructure plus small population equate to? It's a lot of money, and we are right now, through our budget cycles and capital planning, project planning processes, trying to prioritize a growth within the growth areas, what infrastructure we're going to take on and be able to afford as a tax base that, again, isn't growing. We're growing very incrementally. Sorry, I didn't mention this. Our new OCP is projecting approximately 111,000 people by 2050. So again, we're not anticipating or expecting a big burst of population to help offset costs or a tax base. So addressing this challenge, we, as a local government, our tool is, as suggested by other presenters, the DCC bylaw or other tools that the province has recently provided local governments to explore, which Prince George needs to still delve into deeper. And we would also look for grants from either provincial and or federal government levels to help offset the cost of the infrastructure needed to not only, I guess, encourage development, but also just retain the developments we have. And I believe that is my last slide. It is. Thank you, everyone.
Great. Thank you, Deanna. I am going to ask you to stay on, and we will go to our Q&A window, and I invite everyone else to join me or us. So Deanna, Chris, Hasib, and Emily, come on. While you're doing that, just a few comments from what I've observed. You talked a lot about the challenges of complying with the provincial housing targets. I heard issues relating to floodplain development, issues relating to geotechnical and topographical challenges, and servicing requirements, and all expensive endeavors. We also heard about transit-oriented development designations that sometimes did not make sense. And I'm wondering how these designations were chosen, if there was any consultation with local staff. I don't know. You can tell me. And before we go to our questions, I'm going to ask Guy Patterson to provide your comments, Guy, on what you heard from our speakers. Any observations? What do you think?
Well, I will say that I'm never ever going to do a PowerPoint presentation again because of how good all the ones I just saw were. Thanks, you guys. And you know what, Sophie, I wondered, just given the time, if it would be best for me not to say anything except in answer to specific questions that people might have. But
sure, that's fine too. Why don't we start with the three questions that were designated for you, Guy? Sure. What are the consequences of not meeting the December 2025 deadline for updating OCP and zoning bylaw?
Yeah, I don't know if we have any specific instructions or threats in that respect, but I do think that the long-standing provision in the Act under, I had it in front of me, in the Local Government Act under Section 584 that says that if there's a bylaw of a local government that the province doesn't like, I think the wording is it considers as contrary to the public interest of British Columbia, then the minister may notify the local government of the minister's objections and require the council or board to alter the bylaw. And if that's not done, then ultimately cabinet can order the bylaw to be altered in accordance with the minister's notice. So that's very similar to the consequences, I think, of failing to comply with the housing target order, or of failing to comply with some of the previous zoning mandates. Anyway, so my guess is that eventually the province might step in and order the bylaw to be amended eventually for you. That'd be my guess.
Okay, thank you. And when will more details be available regarding the definition of a servicing officer?
Yeah, I think Hasib maybe mentioned that we do now have the regulation. It's called the Planning and Land Use Regulation, the Planning and Land Use Management Regulation under the Local Government Act. And anticipation of another question, I did confirm you can find it on the BC Laws website. And here it is. So yeah, it says that for the purpose of 513.2, the following classes of persons are prescribed as persons who can be designated by bylaw as approving officers, and they are municipal engineers, municipal chief planning officers, or persons who are in a substantially equivalent position, some other employee of the municipality, and persons under contract with the municipality. So, so that's the list so far.
Okay, I don't know if you've answered this yet, Guy, but where can practitioners locate provincial regulations enacted by the Lieutenant Governance in Council?
Yeah, so I think that just means by cabinet as opposed to by a minister. And I'm not sure if the question is specific to cabinet regulations, but typically they can be found on the BC Laws website, like I just mentioned. And if you want assistance navigating that, you can call us or any lawyer or anyone else in your organization. But most regulations are there either under the legislation tab or under the ministerial order tab. With the orders, by the ministerial orders as compared to the cabinet orders are sometimes a little bit harder to find, but they are generally speaking all on there. And if you want to find legislation that's in progress, there's another, you can find that on the, pretty sure it's, I don't know if it's on the BC Laws website, but there's a way to find it all online for sure as well.
Okay, thank you. I just wanted to say thank you to Salwa in the chat window for bringing to our attention. Yes, there are other infrastructure considerations other than engineering, such as healthcare, hospitals, schools, daycares, etc. So thank you for bringing that up. Let's go on to the questions now. We'll start with the second question on our list. Have you been able to reduce the time for rezoning and permitting? Let's go to Chris first.
Yes and no.
I knew it would be complicated with you, Chris.
No, you knew I wouldn't give you a simple answer. Why would I do that? I mean, in my presentation, I did touch on some of those triage actions to help us regulate the flows. So not necessarily pouncing on everything all at once. And I spoke about prioritizing the applications where the development rights are already locked in via the zoning, as opposed to creating new development entitlements. All that said, we do have a council that has recognized the scale of the challenge and has given additional resources to us. So we have done a number of internal actions as well to help our processing times. So obviously Bill 44 perceived that the real bottleneck to delivering housing was zoning restrictions. Now, when you remove that, something else becomes the bottleneck. So we're anxious that it doesn't become our processing ability is now the limiting factor. So we're working on making sure that is not the case. Something else will eventually become, it could be the availability of local construction labor or financing. But yeah, alongside all of those engineering interventions are a whole load of administrative things that we're doing as well. I just didn't have time to get into them.
Thank you. Anybody else? Would anybody else like to jump in?
I could just say briefly, Delta, we're pretty focused on streamlining the processes. Our building permits are turned around within a week. So we're pretty proud of some of the initiatives. I'm not the best person to speak to exactly why that's happening. I'm definitely more on the policy side of things. But if you wanted to know more, you're welcome to reach out to me and I can connect you with someone.
Great, thank you. Anybody else? Okay, we'll move on to What has been the uptake for the provincial standardized housing designs? Maybe we'll go to Deanna.
Sure, thanks, Sophie. I, again, a bit disconnected from the day-to-day with respect to the permitting and applications, but my understanding, I haven't heard of any applications we've received, certainly with that being the informing piece of documentation. However, the housing strategy document I noted in my presentation, that is one of the recommendations we're putting forward, is to consider for Prince George kind of like a pre-approved building set of plans. Recognizing us being a winter community, we have our code items that have to be addressed in terms of snow load and such. So we, I participated, I think with CMHC actually, in a conversation about Canadian building standard booklet of a catalog of housing, but the code piece, as well as just where you are in Canada, let alone the province of BC, in terms of our climatic zone, is going to be something I'm not sure is going to be easily standardized. So again, haven't seen much uptake or noise here about that being used, but something we are considering as well, just for more local focus for PG.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Hasib, how about you in Maple Ridge?
I would say it's been minimal. We received around more than 50. We have been tracking the pre-application process for SMOOS for people who have been wanting to do pre-apps. There's been more than 50. And they're not really following the standardized, the provincial designs. So I would say very minimal. And part of the challenge is also, you know, there needs to be code references and other things for them to be able to submit a building permit application. So I think it's a combination of both.
Emily, how about you?
Sorry, Sophie, I've lost the question here in my.
What has been the
reiterate it?
uptake? Yeah, what has been the uptake for the provincial standardized housing designs?
Minimal.
Minimal.
Yeah, so I mean, it's partly due to the type of SMOO that we allow right now, and partly due to we're just not seeing people referencing those designs. They tend to come in with a very, because it's so expensive in Metro Vancouver and probably elsewhere to build like a laneway or a coach house or a garden suite or something, we're finding that the people come in have a very specific need in mind. So they want to design something so their aging parent can live there. So I would say not much to sum that up.
Interesting. Chris, what about in North Cowichan?
I don't really know. I mean, we've seen uptake of Bill 44, particularly in actively developing erstwhile single-family subdivisions, and now seeing duplexes and duplexes with lock-off suites and triplexes. So a sampling of 30 building permits, we found 14 units already that would not have existed if it were not for Bill 44. Of those, how many of the standardized designs? I don't know. I suspect none. But I haven't been too motivated to peer too deeply beneath the hood of all of our building permits.
Interesting. Okay, great. On to the next question. Are you affected by the availability of data to support proactive planning? Do you have the tools you need to do the work you have to do? Where should we go? We'll go to Emily.
I have many thoughts on this one, and kind of, I'm a little unclear on the question, but I guess I'll offer some thoughts here. I almost feel like there's a bit too much data because we've got different prescribed methodologies for different assessments of housing need, for example. And this is the most acute example that's affecting Delta, where we had a housing target order that was based on a set of data. And then we had a housing needs assessment approximately 1 year later based on a similar set of data with expanded indicators that gave us a number that was more than double our housing target order number. So And on top of that, we have projections from Metro Vancouver. So we took our own, we took all this and we said we want custom projections that we can use and we can rely on. So I wouldn't say we're limited by that. I think there's lots of data out there if you know how to get it. I feel like there's almost too much, that it becomes competing, and it's hard to explain to council and especially to the public why there's so many different numbers out there and what we're actually planning for.
That's very interesting. Any other thoughts from anybody else? No, you're good. Okay. This is a two-part question. Where are we? How can proactive planning ensure the needs of all income levels are met, as well as homeownership and rental housing balancing? So in other words, how are we creating just communities? Any idea? Maybe Deanna?
Sorry, Sophie, I'm trying to think. We certainly, like, we're not getting too involved in, I'd say, the income level. But again, with the housing types, and again, like our orders all indicate this guideline of what types we should be aiming for per community. I think that would be perhaps the focus. Can you say the question again? I'm just missing it on the screen here.
Yeah, so there are two questions and they're kind of similar. How can we proactively plan to ensure the needs of all income levels are met? And how are you balancing home ownership and rental housing?
Oh, there we go. Okay.
I guess they're looking at market housing, non-market housing. That's probably
So again, like the city of Prince George, we wouldn't control to say this has to be rental, this has to be market. But in terms of meeting the needs of income levels, I think it's like the city of Prince George is at the table. For example, if we have land available with our partners through BC Housing or Northern Health Authority or both, to say, yeah, let's get together and do this project to help address that portion of our population that would need housing. And I think from the proactive planning perspective, just using the land use and through OCP and your zoning to encourage the higher densities around things like using the community assessment in mind, having your amenities and groceries and such all within a certain time or distance, or being able to be walkable, that type of thing. So we're not reliant in Prince George, especially on vehicles and such. So that's kind of from a planning perspective, I think what could be done. It's just then implementing it. That would be the next step.
Right. Any other thoughts? That's pretty thorough.
Sophie, I couldn't resist mentioning that I think this was already touched on by Deanna, but in the housing needs report methodology, it's pretty clear that the housing needs assessment has to include, data on income levels and statements about current needs for affordable rental, special needs, seniors, family housing, people experiencing homelessness. So at least from that perspective, I think the province's response might be, well, the way to address the needs of all income levels is to do exactly the kind of thing that we are prescribing that you must do in your housing needs report, at least. That might be a starting point anyway.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Guy.
Maybe I'll add to it. I think, there's a new tool. It's inclusionary zoning. There's density bonus approaches that we are looking into to encourage more different income levels or different types of affordability. I know other municipalities in Lower Mainland do a good job at it. And I would just leave the thought here. I think housing affordability, this is kind of an interesting one. If you go back to the 1970s and 80s, there's a lot of federal funding that used to create rental housing. And, that's kind of missing. And I think that hasn't been a conversation. And I know amongst us planners, we've been talking about that. There's only so much you can go with inclusionary zoning. And I spoke about the land trust, the CAC implementation into bringing, working with BC Housing and other nonprofits. But I think there's only so much that a municipality or a local government can go, and with competing interests for servicing, because no development pays for itself. Even your DCCs have assessed factors, right? So I think that's a conversation that should happen.
Thank you. Okay, why don't we go on to how to fund infrastructure. So what are the best ways to fund infrastructure upgrades that support new housing development? I know a little bit of a controversial question. Chris.
The best way is to get the feds to pay for it with a successful application to the HAF, which we've tried to do twice with no success. So I guess we have to lift ourselves up by our own bootstraps. So, I mean, ultimately, it's a political question of who should pay for that. To what extent is it all going to be put onto development, perhaps to the point where development becomes financially unviable due to the scale of upgrades needed, or do we think that providing housing is sufficiently important that it's something that existing taxpayers should shoulder the burden of? But it's important to put the numbers to it, to do that modeling, to figure out what the upgrades are. And the messy reality is you're going to use all of the mechanisms at your disposal. Some of the things will be front-loaded by the municipality. Other things will be constructed by developers. Maybe for the more significant ones, you even need to have a consortium of developers who can pull something together to create things. So I think you need to look at all the tools in your armory and be prepared to use all of them, because it's not easy.
Mm-hmm. Anybody else?
Sophie, I just can't help but mentioning, it seems like a long time ago now, but I'm looking back at the provincial policy manual and site standards that came out with Bill 44, and it has 2 paragraphs under section 6.1, and the title of that section is funding infrastructure upgrades. Now, I don't know if that would answer the question of the best ways, but at least, that would be the province's answer, at least to some of the ways.
So there are ways. I guess the question might be, how do you choose which way is best for your community? That's the real question, I do believe. Yeah, thank you very much, Guy, for pointing that out. Going on to infrastructure, is there an optimal scale and or approach to planning for infrastructure upgrades, water, sewer, and transportation?
I could offer something on this.
Thank you, Emily.
I thankfully had one of our engineering managers on the call, and she's offered some responses. So in Delta, when we're considering upgrades, we look at the age, condition, capacity, all that typical stuff. And we look at our new OCP. And so right now we've started some neighborhood servicing plans to align with those growth areas in the OCP. And we chose neighborhoods that our models indicated would need really extensive utility upgrades to accommodate SMU and other new land uses. And so we're also doing a North Delta transportation study. So that's kind of the approach we've taken, is look at what the OCP has enabled and look at the areas that are potentially the worst equipped to meet that, and plan for those needs.
Great, thank you. Okay, Guy, if you have a moment, could you provide a reference document for what you just noted about servicing?
It's the policy manual that came out with Bill 44. It's called Provincial Policy Manual and Site Standards. It's probably on the internet somewhere. The blue sticky is mine, but otherwise, there it is.
Thank you. So another question, how are you planning to facilitate new improved public transit in growing neighborhoods? Is that really within the scope of a municipality? I don't know. Who would like to talk about that? Hasib?
Yeah, I think I mentioned bus rapid transit coming to Maple Ridge a little bit. Usually there are shared funding models between the province and the municipality. So I think something like that, that's a strategic priority, would be a shared model. Like any transit is a shared model. So I think there's strategic transportation. For example, Maple Ridge has a strategic transportation plan as to how you can manage not just street upgrades, but public transit in different areas and the frequencies. So it's like any other conversation. What's your competing priorities when the budget time comes, and how do you fund your public transit, and how do you work with BC Transit to, or TransLink, depending on where you are, to help facilitate more frequent service or expanded weekend service. So it's a combination of the two.
Okay, thank you. Any other comments on that? Okay.
I would maybe offer something, Sophie. I think it's
Sure.
TransLink's responsibility in Delta, really, and what we do is we've created the density in certain areas where it was already, somewhat serviced by transit to facilitate more service. And so since we've done that, we're just going to kind of continually advocate to TransLink and to work with them to try and improve service to those areas.
Great, thank you. I'm looking at the time, it's 1:30, and I know some of you have to leave. So we will end it here. Thank you to everybody. I'll put our final slide on. Thank you to everybody. We have Emily Gray with the City of Delta, Hasib Nadvi, the City of Maple Ridge, Chris Osborne with the Municipality of North Cowichan, Deanna Wasnik with the City of Prince George, and of course, Guy Patterson with Young Anderson. Thank you all so much for your presentations and insight and legal advice. Much appreciated. I saw some clapping there. There it is again. Just to leave you with our final slide, if you are a PIBC member, log on and record your 1.5 CPL units today. If you're a presenter, you can record 3 units for today. Some upcoming events. We have a regular webinar, number 2, coming up on March 26th, AI in Planning Practice. Can't miss this one. Very informative, practical information on how you as a planner can use AI in your work. April 30th, we have webinar number 7, PLN webinar number 7, Development Economics of Housing. And then, of course, June 10th to the 13th, we have the PIBC Annual Conference in Vancouver. Please join us. I know that Guy Patterson, Young Anderson is a sponsor, and we thank them very much. And we have many other sponsors participating and presenters, and it should be a fabulous event. So thank you again to everybody, and we'll call it a webinar. We'll say bye for now. Bye.
Thank you, Sophie.
Thank you. I'll leave the chat window up a little longer in case people have any questions to add. We can always send them to the group and see if they're willing to answer after the fact. Okay, bye-bye.